All right, everybody. Welcome back to Pulp Fiction Renaissance Podcast. I'm your host, Richard Barrett, with the one and only illustrious James Lafond. James, how you doing today?
Doing all right. Somewhat south of illustrious, I fear, but
well, okay. Illustrious -10, we'll say. It's too early in the morning for illustrious. Well, James, on the last we did our last podcast we shot, you were wearing a kind of reddish orange shirt. Today you're wearing a blue shirt. Does that have any symbolism to any elephants or donkeys? Is there a hidden message there? What's going on?
Well, this isn't a shirt that was given to me by a guy. Most shirts that guys give me have branding on it, So you're the slave or whatever, NFL team or nation, what have you. This was picked out for me at a thrift store by a girl named Lily, who was helping me pack a couple of years ago, and she was just looking for the lightest shirts possible so that they wouldn't take up too much weight. They wouldn't amount to too much weight in my rucksack. So it's hardly weighs anything. So it happened to be at the top of the rucksack when I reached in this morning, and there you have it. So
very nice. Well, I don't really like, believe it or not, our viewers may be surprised to learn that I very rarely ever wear a suit in my daily life. And most of the time I'm wearing jeans or a t-shirt or those like Adidas soccer sweatpants. And I do not like shirts with branding on them, because to me it just says I'm not comfortable enough in my own identity. I need to have some kind of identity to project. And the old time action stars in the 50s and 60s never wore any branding, and they were pretty cool. So I feel like,
funny thing is so many, I don't even know. The only reason why I even know what a lot of what's printed on a lot of the shirts is because people have come up to me and they're like, "Do you realize what you're wearing?" I think some things have been given to me as kind of like jokes. I have a shirt that's like, I don't know if I'm white or Indian. That Riley gave it to me. He also gave me a Black Guns Matter shirt. So I don't read shirts on me or other people usually, but I've had people like just pull me up in stores and say, "Hey, you know what you're wearing? You don't look like the kind of guy that would be wearing that." One of them was like some kind of, it had oxygen tanks on there. So it was like some kind of like tree hugger shirt or something like that. So I, the only ones I kind of knew what they were, shirts that like fight promoters and gym owners had given me. So.
Well, that's funny you say that, because we were, my brother and I were watching, this was a while back, one of your Lancaster Aganistics videos, and you're wearing a shirt with like a Pokemon video game character on it. And he's like, "Does he know what he's wearing?" I said, "Probably not. I'm sure it was the only thing that was clean when he put it on." It was like, he just couldn't get over that.
Oh, is that the purple shirt where I was fighting a tall blonde guy?
I think so. You guys were outside, and I think there were some sticks involved, and it's like a cartoon anime dragon.
I didn't know what it was, but I was getting really fat, and I was still at that stage where I was a little bit sensitive about my prodigious beer gut, So I put that shirt on, and he had invited me up there for this, and I had been coaching him, and I was winding down. I was in my 50s, and he's like, "Well, I thought maybe we'd film your last fight. We'll do this." He said, "'Cause I don't really think you should be fighting anymore." And I was like, "Okay." And then when I put that shirt on before he went out and fought, he said, "This was going to be nice." He said, "But it's on now." He said, "You're going to fight me wearing that Cage shirt." It's like, So,
Yeah, I had the feeling there was a story behind it. My brother was just, he was, why is he wearing that? So, James, if you ever get into
I
an
didn't.
altercation because of a shirt you're wearing, you're gonna be like,
I
listen,
used
listen, I
I
I
used
don't
to
watch
wear
any
that.
TV. I don't know what the shirt means. I have no
I used to wear that shirt when I worked on the night crew at Gershbeck's, and sometimes people would come up to me and tap me on the shoulder and they'd say "cool shirt." So I thought it was okay. I mean, it's uh, yeah. My aesthetics aren't very good. I mean, I had an interview with a girlfriend one time. We'd been seeing each other for a while, and I could tell she was at the point. She's like, I'm either going to dump this guy or I'm gonna reel him in, and I'm gonna colonize him and get the bank card and the whole thing. And she knew at the time I was dating 5 chicks, and they all knew it. You know, the 3 chicks that lived in town, it kind of bothered them a little bit. The 2 out of town chicks, it didn't really bother them so much. But she comes over and she's wearing sunglasses, and she actually uh, sits me down and she turns on the light behind her. This is really like an interview. This is like a thing, okay? And she's asking me all these different questions. We ended up, the deal breaker was I wouldn't buy a house. At the time, I was actually, the rare moment in my life when I was making decent money. And I said, no, I'm not going to buy a house. I failed to one time. I'm not going to do that. That's why I ended up not, like, I guess, marrying this chick. But at a certain point, she, and it was weird. See, there was a picture in this room. The psychotic chick that used to hit me. Okay. Uh, but I mean, she was really, well, anyways, there were things about her but uh, she brought a picture over one time, and she said she set it up like right next to where the clock was because I slept on this futon. She said, "This is to scare all the other whores away because I know I could kick their asses, right?" And she she sets this picture. She sets this picture up there. Okay, and the girl that was interviewing me. Uh, Oh, okay. We don't have to know any details, but she was the top girl. Okay. And this was the picture was like right next to the phone where I would have to get up after 2 hours sleep and like, and reach over here and turn, not the phone, turn the clock off. And there would come a certain point in every encounter with this lady, which was when they conducted the interview, where she was like, look, I don't know how you can do it, but I can't make love and look at that hard bitch. she, and she would slap it down, right? Well, at a certain point, Nancy, who was the stewardess, who used to, whenever she was in Baltimore, she'd come and see me. And she was the one the other ones were jealous of because she looked like the girl that played in the Dukes of Hazzards, you know.
Oh,
Okay.
the original with Catherine Bach,
Yeah, yeah,
and
yeah.
she's a flight
She was like a
stewardess.
ringer. She was also from Virginia too. She was from rural Virginia. But anyhow, she, you know, she didn't care. She was just using me. She was living with a hockey player in Philadelphia, But she told me she's like, "You're my stamina guy." I was like, "Okay, thanks." So she gets up one day and she walks over to that picture and she said, I don't know what your schedule is during the week, but when I get here on the weekend, sometimes this pitcher is standing up and sometimes this pitcher is face down. If you turn the pitcher down, you would put it on its back. So I'm figuring that the girl that stood it up and put it here is the one that brought it. And then another girl is pulling it face down. Okay. So she examined the dust. I didn't clean my room. She examined the dust on the pitcher, and she said there is more dust on the back of the pitcher than there is on the top rim. of the picture. So she declared that, she said, your favorite local girl, okay, is the girl that slaps this picture down, okay, because there's more dust on the back of the picture than there is on the top rim. And she said, I know before the other girl comes over, you flip the picture up. Am I right? And I was like, yeah, before, Pepper comes over, I flip the picture up. So she's like, yeah. So she's like, yeah, so she said, it's a shame there's not a picture of the other one so I could compare. I said, oh, yeah. She's like a foot shorter than you. But anyhow, so this girl, the one that used to slap the picture down so that she could, reach her, destination. She's looking at me and she's asking me all these different questions. And then she takes her glasses off, her sunglasses off. And she said, I got one more question to ask you. And she covered my eyes. She was really well built. She was built like my roommate, who was a black lesbian Republican NASCAR fan. She told me, she's like, I could get Play-Doh and design your perfect woman. This is a big ball on the bottom, no waist, a little ball on the top. She's like, you're real simple, right? So she was, she had quite a figure. And she always chided me for like not looking into her eyes. Well, I said, well, just remind me and I will. But I'm looking at everything else. So she covers my eyes with her hand, and we had been dating since 1993, and this was 2000. This was after I got my. Oh wow, this was like 2007. This was after I got my. Right after John Bosch broke my finger in a fight in Chesapeake, Virginia. And she gets out of her chair, and she's not much taller than me when she stands up. She and she's taking the sunglasses off. She covers my eyes. She says, what color are my eyes? Bro, I didn't know. I mean, I'd only been dating this chick for 14 years, right? I didn't know. I was like, well, she's a brunette, so she's probably got brown eyes. I said, brown baby, I would never forget that. She's like, oh, really? And she pulled her hand off, and she's like, even though you won't buy me a house, I'll still keep dating you and loving you. I didn't think you'd get that one right, She like gives me a big hug. Well, it was.
I love it. Your decision-making process is, I got to flip a coin here. All right, here we go. Roll the dice.
Yeah, so I don't really. I only know what's on my shirts because people showed me when they gave them to me, or somebody tapped me on the shoulder at the store, and they're like, "You know what you're wearing, right?" Like I was wearing a New York Giants shirt down in Baltimore. Or
oh no! That's like wearing a Chicago Cubs shirt in St. Louis. Like you do not want to do that.
Like, bro, the Steelers, I could understand you trying to pick a fight, but what the hell? That's not,
dude. It's like an Ohio State shirt, in Michigan country. That's just, oh man, oh my gosh, gee, Manelli, that is funny. Because see, when I moved to the Midwest, I didn't know. I mean, I don't follow college football or anything like that, and so we moved out, and everybody's like, okay, you got to know, who's your Big Ten team? Are you green? Are you blue? Are you Ohio? Are you Illinois? What are you? And I'm like, what are you talking about? But oh yeah, no, it's like, are you Sunni or you Shia? It's like Bloods or Crips. In the greater Midwest, you have to know. You have to decide. Yeah, I don't care. There's a movie called Play Dirty with Michael Caine and his sidekick when he goes there in North Africa in World War II. And when he goes behind German lines, he puts on a German hat and turns on a German radio station. And then when he leaves, he throws it off, puts on a British hat, puts on a British radio station. So wherever I'm at, I'll put on the hat, whatever it may be. Take it off. Okay, put the other one on. Oh my gosh. Well, James, this is a great way to start an interesting topic. Today's topic is something we were talking about when we shot the podcast on Haft yesterday, which was really fantastic. We started to get to the end, and I was very excited because there's so much depth we could cover, but I cut it short so we could make it its own animal. And it is the topic of World War I combatants and Pulp Fiction fantasy and the mythology that they wrote. How did World War I shape them? We started getting into this with Tolkien. We started getting into this with C.S. Lewis and a few lesser known authors. And I got to say, actually, hold on just 1 second. It's the one thing I didn't grab. How could I not? 1 second. I want to show you something.
Okay. Well, Richard's mom, if you watched this, I'm sorry, but I couldn't help myself there.
Okay, I missed that one. It'll be
I just apologize to your mother in case she views this.
That's okay. I've told her about you, and she's like, that's James Lafond, man. That's one of Richard's just weird friends. Okay. My family puts up with a lot from me. They like I said, I talk a lot about. Like I said, eagles and snakes and Solarians and Tellurgics and how do they relate to astrological signs, and they're like, it's Richard, man. That's just part of the package deal. So to channel those energies, 7 years ago, in 2014, for the 100-year anniversary of World War I wrote and published my first book, which I have right here. This is it, The Forgotten History of World War I from the Dark Ages to 1939. I am Richard Barrett II.
Cool.
And this bad boy is 475 pages, and it is 8 by 11 inches. So this thing is a behemoth, or some people pronounce it behemoth. I don't know, Caribbean. But this was my first ever book. And World War I is a topic most people know nothing about. I published that book. I started researching it in August of 2014 after I sat down and watched War Horse. And I thought War Horse was the stupidest World War I movie I had ever seen. And I said, this is ridiculous. So it started where I was teaching at a homeschool co-op at this time. That was my job. It was my senior year in high school. And I was teaching at a homeschool co-op that my mom ran and my brothers attended. And so I said, okay, well, I'm going to teach a class about World War I. So I taught the class about World War I. And I was just anything written on World War I for lay people that are not academics is just absolute trash. And so I said, okay, well, I'm going to start writing my own like handouts, and they would be like 8 or 10 pages. And there was a article in the Wall Street Journal about how all of these World War I books are being published. This was August, September, October 2013. So all these World War I books are being published for the 100-year anniversary. And so my mom said, you need to publish your own book. So long story short, I said, okay. So she said, you're already writing this. Why don't you publish it? So I was continuing to research. I'd had about a quarter of it written. And then come January of 2021, January of 2014, I started going to town on this. And for 5 months, that was all I did. Every 2 weeks, I would come out of my room to go to one of these debate tournaments. It was my final year in a national speech and debate league. We travel all over the country. It would start at 7 in the morning, end at midnight. You'd be locked in a building during that time for 3 days, and you do it every 2 weeks. And I even missed a couple of those because I told everybody, hey, I'm writing this book. And nobody thought I was serious. And then come June of 2014 for the 100-year anniversary, actually, I think it was May 23rd, I got the first copy of the book in the mail. And I was so excited. I didn't know what it was going to look like. I never published a book before. So I'd written this. I went to a giant homeschool convention in Richmond, Virginia at the time, sold out on the second day of a third day of the convention. I sold I bought 60 copies and I sold out of them. And then in August of 2014, I start attending the University of Mary Washington. And I'm going to get my degree in history because I've written a published history book. This makes sense. So they have this open house for all history majors to come into and meet the history faculty and all this. And this is a picturesque college. It's got this Georgian kind of Greco-Roman style architecture, and there's all kind of trees blossoming and ivy, and it's named after George Washington's mama, Mary Washington. And so I go in there, and it's I think, is it the James Monroe building is the history building, because James Monroe lived in Fredericksburg. And I go in there, and back then I wore suits a lot. I was not a working man back then. So I'm wearing the type of getup you see here. And I go in there and I go to talk to the military history professor because I'm just so excited. It's the 100-year anniversary of World War I. I've written this book. All these books are being published. And I said that this guy he was an Annapolis graduate. He was in the Navy and he graduated from Annapolis, and he was an old guy. His name was Porter, I think, and he was an old kind of Southern looking, kind of a Colonel Sanders meets Tom Wolfe kind of a guy. And you just got the sense he did not want to be there, and he did not want to be doing his job. Okay, he was just doing it till retirement. But I go in there and I'm just bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, and I said, hey, what do you think about this in World War I and this in World War I and this and this and this and this? And he's like, well, I haven't really read any of that stuff. The latest book on World War I read I can see the cover in my mind. I have it. I don't even remember what it was called, but it was some really just bottom tier layman grade book. And I'd been wading through all this first-hand material and specialist academic secondary sources, and he'd never even heard of any of this stuff. And I'm thinking, oh my gosh, I know more about the military history of World War I than the military history professor at this college. That was my introduction to the collegiate experience. And it just went downhill from there. And so I love World War I. It's a topic nobody knows about. And you said in our last podcast that you have a friend who's a specialist in the German diplomatic history of 1880 to 1914. Is that correct?
I read his thesis. It was 177 pages. It was hardbound. He had to pay to get it printed and bound up at the university, and he took it before the eggheads that would crucify him and try to poke holes in his theories. He did a lot of his research down at the Enoch Pratt Free Library in Baltimore, which is actually a very good library. And if you're an academic or if you're a writer, they treated me like I was a king there just because I had a book published. You're like a rock star to librarians when you had a book published, that they actually care about books. And he did microfilm research there. And it's I remember taking part in AP history in Art Richardson's class, taking part in a origins of World War I debate. It's a subject that they like to use for debate. He explained to us because he said, we just still don't know. I mean, this is the world didn't, it had been a long time since there had been a major European land war, and Europeans thought that somehow they would interact with technology differently than the Americans did in the Civil War, and they didn't extrapolate it. They didn't know how horrible it was going to be. And his opinion was, hey, it looked like, 6 of these countries out of the 7 were itching just to get at it. And any case, my friend he's still a history teacher at a private high school now. He resigned from a Baltimore City school on ethical reasons because they were trying to get him to graduate kids that couldn't read. He resigned from a Baltimore County school on similar ethical reasons. I remember reading the letter that he wrote to the superintendent. And so he took a big pay cut to teach for a small, uh, high school that's called a college. And so he could still teach history, of course. His principal is a woman who's basically, like most academics, anti-intellectual, anti-history. And I did discuss this with him, and he said it's one of those subjects, the deeper you get into, the murkier it is. And he said, I question anybody that thinks that they could come up with a single cause for World War One. He said it's almost like a civilization had an instinct for extinction. And we played the same game called Pax Britannica. We didn't play it together, but I played it with other guys. It's an 8-man game, Pax Britannica. They never let me play a European because I'm a real prick. Okay, I like to work outside the box when I'm playing historical games. So they made me the Jet. Okay, uh, so my only ambition was to have a bigger navy than the Brits. Okay, so and it's pretty clear. If you're playing, I just played an excellent Korean war game. And I'm playing against Sensei Steve. This guy's a better war gamer than me, but I'm better at reading terrain than him. So as long as I'm playing defense, my lack of game mechanics mastery will kind of help me make it a pretty good slugfest. So I'm like his opponent. He could keep, as the American, he could ratchet his commitment up as much as he wants to blow my ox carts apart as I'm trying to bring supplies down from the Yalu River. But he could start World War III. He's on the Russian and Chinese border. So the American loses when he starts World War III. Basically the Korean wins if he gets a draw. The North Korean wins if he gets a draw. It looks like we couldn't finish the game. We were headed to that. Well, Pax Britannica is an empire building game in which the 7 major European nations and the Japanese and the Americans are included. Okay, so there's the Americans, there's the Japs, and there's 6 European nations. Italy and Germany are included. They're a problem because they base by geography and what happened in the 30 Years' War and the Napoleonic Wars. They formed as nations later, and they had less naval capacity, so they had to be more aggressive to try to catch up on grabbing territory in Africa if they wanted to be a player. And basically, it's everybody against Britain. Britain, if it gets to the point where Britain does not have more than every other nation as far as colonial possessions, then that's going to trigger World War One. The tensions are going to be at such a point because of the scramble for global resources. At the time, you needed to have coaling stations set up all over the world if you were even going to be a major power to have a navy. So part of this was driven by technology. Essentially, the war games are great because they're apolitical. These are just nerds that are looking at triggers for what's going to happen. So in the Korea game, is it right or is it wrong to bomb all these population centers? The war gamers don't give a shit. They just want to know if it's going to start World War III or not. And of course, that's a loss. I was trying to get the Americans to start World War III. I wiped out a couple of American regiments, okay, in such a way that I was trying to get him to up his commitment so he could start World War III. So anyhow, with the Pax Britannica game, Art Richardson, my old history teacher, my friend that got his doctorate in German diplomacy between the Gilded Age and World War I, they both told me, I said, you can't pick out a single cause for this war. it's almost like subconsciously they all wanted it, and consciously some of the powers wanted it. Um, the and what Pax Britannica teaches you is that the technology and the scramble for natural resources in such a way as funneled by the technology, because you had coal-based technology. A lot of the places you were exporting, they didn't even have coal resources. You'd have to ship your coal there and make these big dumps. Um, it's almost like industrial technology created World War I. Okay, just the needs of industrial technology, and the end game of mercantilism combined with industrial technology. It's something like this was going to happen, and Jack London predicted it in The Iron Heel. He thought it would happen 20 years later. He wrote this in 1911, and I think it seems to be the consensus of those four novelists that we were talking about, that you could point fingers at, who shot the, who went to war to support their ally instead of to maybe, look out for the health. But ultimately, when you read Edison, Peake, Tolkien, and Lewis, it's almost like modern economics and industrial technology kind of drove mankind into that war. If it wasn't that war, it was something like that was going to happen. In Europe. So that's kind of my aggregate reading, my discussions with the people that studied it, that no more than me. That as far as causes, and I think Barbara Tuchman's probably the best one you could read as far as decisions that were made leading up to it, and just how we're going to be home before the leaves fall, and it's August. This war's just going to be over right away. That's you're a bunch of nations marching to war with technology that they haven't tried out yet. Now, what could go wrong?
That is, wow. So I have a few things on that one. So that's very interesting, because your conclusions were roughly the same as mine. You had, Germany knew it was kind of the bastard stepchild. And that created kind of a neurosis in the minds of their leadership, particularly Kaiser Wilhelm. So he was going to be very aggressive, even when there were opportunities to, hey, tone it down a little bit. We'll maintain the balance of power. There's a saying from Saul Alinsky, Rules for Radicals. Wonderful book. Mentor to a lady you refer to as the Gorgon Queen, and another president whose middle name is the last name of a particular Iraqi dictator. He said, if you're negotiating and you get 30% of what you wanted, that's 30% more than what you had. Whereas, you read about Kaiser Wilhelm, and that was not his attitude. He said, I want 100% right now. You're going to give it to me at the end. Also this idea that, if the British didn't have everything, then they were going to essentially have nothing, and they were going to fight. And this idea that a lot of people did see this coming. My two areas of focus were twofold. You said no one wants to cover strategic, operational, and tactical level decisions in the same book. I know you said that on our last podcast about halves. I noticed that too, and I thought that was stupid. So I said, okay, I'm going to do that in my book. So what I did was I charted the development of Britain, France, Germany, and Russia from the fall of the Roman Empire all the way up to 1914. Because it seems to be this misconception that in World War I, we think of, in your best British academic accent, all the great powers were essentially the same and then just started fighting each other. Well, no, each of these countries had a very unique history and experience. They were formed at different times. Their geography had an influence on their formation and their government. And then that really influenced their operational and tactical decisions. You can chart that, and that's what I did. So, tactically, the British fought different than the Germans, who fought different than the French. And, you start getting in their mindset. You say, okay, well, I can understand how that commander made that decision based off of his training, the historical experience of his nation, and what he thought, the information he had at the time. And it makes you start thinking, okay, well, it's easy to point fingers at these guys saying, well, the lions led by donkeys thing, right? But then you're thinking, well, if I was him, would I have made a different choice? I don't know. So this idea of the British tactical experience versus the German tactical experience versus the French tactical experience. Now, I focused only on the Western Front in my book. I had a chapter about the East Africa War, which was pretty good. I had a chapter about the British and Japanese invasion of the German settlements in China. And then I had like 3 Middle East chapters on Gallipoli and Lawrence of Arabia because I knew a lot about that. But primarily the focus is on the Western Front. And you're 100% right, particularly in the British experience. Lord Haldane was made the Minister of War in 1905. And he knew straight away from the Boer War, and a lot of these guys that were junior officers that had been promoted to senior officers that had fought in the Boer War, they understood, okay, our days of fighting Zulus and dervishes with spears are over. The Boers really showed us what a contemporary fighting force could do. And the Germans were sending Krupp artillery pieces and Mauser rifles to the Boers. So they said, we know what their technology is capable of. They killed a lot of our guys. We need to really get organized. And the British were organized a lot better, much better than the French, much better than the Russians. And I would argue they were organized better than the Germans. Now, the Germans adapted as the war went on in their own way, and they did a pretty good job. But they definitely saw the writing on the wall. Now, when it comes to Barbara Tuchman, that's funny. I was not a big fan of Barbara Tuchman and rejected her thesis. And if you ever want to scare a historian, tell them you don't like Barbara Tuchman. And that's going to be like, you can't say that. You can't say that. Barbara Tuchman's ghost is going to haunt you to your grave. How dare you say that? I said that to the guy.
That's because she writes well enough to appeal to lay people,
She does. And that was the thing. I said, okay, the people who are writing to appeal to lay people are not writing with all the facts. And that's why that's why their thesis is accepted. And I said, okay, well, I literally I had written the chapters, like the 5 or 6 chapters on the nations, their history up to 1914. So by January of 2014, I was now going to start writing the World War I chapters. And I said, how am I going to do this? Because there has never been, a World War I lay book that I like written. So I didn't really have a model. I was at an antique store and I bought a 1957 Black Hawk comic. Okay, and Black Hawk was a character. He's a Polish fighter pilot, and he's got like a British sidekick, an American sidekick, a French sidekick, like all the World War II Allied powers. Okay, and they fly around in their airplanes, and if they're not shooting Germans, they're shooting some kind of robots or aliens. And I said, I'm gonna write it like this comic book, and instead of there being pictures, the pictures are going to be descriptive paragraphs, and the narration and the verbiage is going to be in the style of this comic book. So I was butchering a lot of sacred cows in this book, in a really weird, you could almost say postmodern, and by that I mean stylistically, not philosophically, in a stylistically postmodern way that I wrote this book. And of course, my I was just rushing to get it published by the time I graduated. So it's riddled with typos, and it doesn't have like page numbers. A lot of pictures in it, though, because there's a lot of public domain pictures. But yeah, your thesis, I definitely agreed with you. And it was also a very interesting conflict, in both the British and the Germans, both. And I learned even more about this in the 7 years since I wrote the book. They really, their officer corps and their enlisted corps had, they were really plugged into a chivalric medieval ethos. This was the 19th century generation of, 19th century romanticism. And You know, I think the word romanticism is interesting. It denotes a philosophy, and it also denotes an artistic movement, and it denotes an artistic way of seeing the world. And the way people think, when people hear World War One, they say, well, romanticism died in World War One. But some of the best war fighters that came out of World War One and even came out after World War One and before World War One all self-identified as romantics. And you think, how is that possible? Guys like Lawrence of Arabia, T.E. Lawrence, your boy, who you've written a lot about, Ernst Jünger.
Well, he was against romanticism. He thought that romanticism was the worst style to write in. Ernst Jünger.
But this idea that in his book, Storm of Steel, it's this idea where, you know, man overcomes all of the terrible things around him, which is a very Pulp Fiction ideal.
Well, he doesn't overcome it; he just survives it. You know, the book where he really writes about what it's like being an old soldier is actually a science fiction book called The Glass Bees. I think he wrote it in the 1950s, and it predicts the internet in a weird way. But there are these glass bees that do this mass communication. So he kind of envisioned the internet as a bunch of little mechanical bees spreading information, which is an interesting way to look at it. And his character is a retired officer, a cavalry officer from a war that's very much like World War One, not like World War Two. He didn't fight in World War Two. He was in trouble with the rulers, so they gave him a cozy spot where he could write his anti-war science fiction novels, you know, so they didn't have to execute him because he was a war hero from World War One. But the character in The Glass Bees is a former cavalry officer, and he's got a job as an advisor for a Disneyland, Disney World type company that makes movies that's based in Italy. And at a certain point, he rejects what the modern world has become, and he goes back into his obsolete mindset, which was to be the old cavalry guy, and he's remembering all of his buddies that died. Okay, so he just died. So if you with Younger's work, his problem with romanticism is this is something that's only going to work for the winners. If you survived on the winning side, then you could afford romanticism. But most of the world doesn't win. At any given time, there's only like a couple of powers that are in the winner's seat. Romanticism can work for their men, but it's not going to serve the survivors on the losing side. So his stuff, his writing, whether it's philosophy like The Forest Passage, okay, or his science fiction, The Glass Bees, or The Storm of Steel, his philosophy is that you could survive, form a connection with the enemy, the more noble elements amongst the enemy, and try to go on from there decently without succumbing to whatever evil force is ruling the society. Because he points out that the winners are going to be ruled by evil, because then that side's going to accrue hubris, and the losers are going to be ruled by evil because they're going to be under this reactionary, you know, system that's infused with bitterness, or it's going to be a system that is sold out to the winners, one way or the other. You either end up in East Germany or West Germany, you know, in Cold War parlance. So he was, and also he did a lot of his science fiction and philosophy he wrote during the Cold War. Mm-hmm. Okay, so that was, and he also wrote Westerns. See, his favorite, where he wrote about trying not to fall into the trap of writing as a romantic because it was false. That was something that he had to remind himself when he was writing Westerns, because it was easy to write a romantic Western. He actually wrote like 4 novels that were set in the old U.S. West.
Yeah.
or The Frontier, which I haven't read. I don't even think they've been translated to English, but he was Neil Gaiman, I think, is the guy that did the introduction to the Glass Bees. And for the science fiction writers like him, he said, this old man scared me to death. Reading Ernst Younger scares me to death because this is the guy that survived death. And he came back. And if you think about it, with the English writers that came out of World War One, that wrote their fantasies were all very dark, except for C.S. Lewis. C.S. Lewis is trying to write for children, but if you read Our Hideous Strength, if you read that trilogy, that's very dark. That's like something that Jack London would have written. Tolkien stuff is extremely dark, and it works with the little brightness the hobbits we think of is in contrast to that. Mervyn Peake is totally Dickensian. It's totally immersed in darkness. And Edison, I mean, the premise in Edison's book, The Warm Ouroboros, all the combatants in this fantasy world that are stuck in something that's kind of like World War II, but he wrote this like in 1921, okay? It's like a medieval World War II that these guys are in. So he's predicting, that, yeah, there's going to be another round of this stuff. They're all demons. All the good guys, all the bad guys, and one of the guys, his name is Spitfire. He's like the big hero. There's three brothers, and one of the heroes, his name is Spitfire. These guys, they're good guys, but they're demons. They're fighting against evil demons. So there he's pointing out what happens to the soldier, okay, when he's put into an industrial warfare. He becomes this biological grease for this killing machine. He essentially becomes something like a demon that's possessing this plane or this tank or tapping on this machine gun as it's mowing down hundreds and thousands of people. So all that stuff was very dark, even though there's romantic elements that elevate it so that you could get a general readership like Tolkien and C.S. Lewis did. You want to read C.S. Lewis's darkness, then you read his nonfiction. You read Screwtape Letters, which is fiction, but read his Abolition of Man, for instance. That's extremely dark. He's predicting human extinction, okay, at the hands of the system that he served. So the way to use Romanticism, that the way those two authors used it, is they used it to make the darkness tolerable. Okay, Younger was harder core than that. He had more combat experience than all of those guys combined. Okay, he was like, nobody did more fighting and killing and getting bombed and getting shot than this guy. Okay, and he couldn't go. It's like being a fighter and trying to write unrealistic combat. He just couldn't go the romantic route because he just thought it would be a portrayal of his experience, okay? But the other guys had spent like maybe a year or two. This guy, every single person he knew was killed. Everybody he knew was killed when he went in to the war. And then everybody he met was killed every few months for years. This guy spent like 4 years in the front lines, okay? So, and he was one of the foremost combat innovators. That's why he was interested in the American West, because the stormtrooper stuff, he called it fighting an Indian file. Well, anyhow, that there's one more thing I'll cover later before we check out on this, because there's a famous German author who actually died in World War I, like in the first part of it, that I'll talk about later. But that'll be kind of brief, and it kind of goes back to like the ultimate origins of it. But the thing that I think that the one thing that Barbara Tuchman really gets right, in my opinion, that the historians that love her do not agree with, okay, nobody really gets on board with what's key to her premise, is that none of these rulers cared about their people. These were highly stratified class societies. Kaiser Wilhelm was a relative to all these other heads of states. He was their cousin. This was like a family poker game. And how much do you care about these cards and these poker chips? Well, that's what people were. That's what divisions and navies and dreadnoughts were to these people. Okay, these weren't people that were being sent to die in the trenches. Like when they guilted a bunch of 15 and 16-year-old British boys into going and getting turned into ground meat by sending these girls out and handing out the white feathers and calling them cowards, you had a bunch of underage guys lying about their age because girls on the streets guilted them into going into this war. It wasn't going to decide anything because the technology wasn't available to really bring it to the type of conclusion that people wanted. People don't want to win a war when they're in a state of total exhaustion. They want to win a war when they're feeling vibrant. You know, they want to be able to exploit it. When you're talking about the type of people that think of his nation as nothing but an economy, you know, when you see, if you want to see what the rulers think of a nation, you've got to go to the Cavuto report and look at, or Max Kaiser, and look at all the economic indicators. That's what a ruler of a nation thinks of a nation. He just thinks of it in these economic terms and in these war fighting terms. He doesn't think of it as people, you know. So I think she didn't make that charge, but she points in that direction, and she felt like her work was incomplete. That's why she went back and wrote The Proud Tower is twice as thick as The Guns of August, and it's basically what the culture was amongst the ruling elites on the eve of World War One, the Great War. So she didn't feel like she had come up with some great thesis for, you know, why this war started. She tried to tell the story of just how the pieces swung into action, and you know, and people marched off the war thinking it was going to be over in a few months. Everybody thought it was going to be over in a few months. You know, there weren't people. I think the Tsar had some suspicion that this war was never going to be over until he was in the ground. You know, but he was basically Tsarist Russia was a great victim of this war. You know, because it was essentially like empire that was still hanging on. You know, but and the Turks were largely a victim of the war also, because it was another medieval style empire that basically gets cannibalized during this whole thing. But the Europeans never really get at each other the way they want to, okay, and then deconstruct those nations and turn them into something like NATO. They don't have the ability to do that in World War One.
No, they did not. Well, and see, you bring up a lot of great points that I'll go into. First one, with the Kaiser, I will show you some of the resources that I used.
He had a gimp arm too, didn't he? Did he have a gimp arm?
He did. He was born, they had problems pulling him out of his mom's womb, and it tore his arm up, so it was really shrunken. And I mean, that guy's like a 007 villain. I mean, from the creepy arm to the weird mustache. You know, he had the gay best friend, Philip Eulenberg, who was like his little sidekick, lackey. You know, I mean, you go and you look at what all these tropes later were based off of, you're like, oh, I can easily see that. You know, he was a guy that was really just, he had his dad, Wilhelm I, was really pro-British and really liberal. And if I recall correctly, it's been a while since I wrote this, his mom was British. And so he had this kind of like softer British side that he didn't like. And then he had his uncle who was a hardcore old school Prussian. He really identified with that.
They were all related. So like his mom's not just British, his mom's related to these other rich pricks that run these other European countries.
Right.
These people were inbred cousins. You had inbred people running the whole continent that were related to each other.
Right. And he was like, you got a sense that he felt like he was sitting at the little kids table and he wasn't over at the cool kids table. And this just created he was not happy about this. So some of the sources I compiled. One of my favorites, this was From Bismarck to Hitler, a compilation of firsthand sources by C.G. Rawl. This one was really good. I mean, there's a piece in here where he calls together basically his Joint Chief of Staff in December of 1912. And he said, look, there's some problems going on in the Balkans. Are you guys ready to exploit this so we can get the war for Lebensraum launched. This is December of 1912. And the Navy guys say, listen, we are not ready for a naval showdown with Britain. You need to give us a couple more years to get this stuff built up because we cannot conceivably win. And the Army guys say, you know what? Okay, why don't you wait a little bit? There is always some nonsense going on in the Balkans that you can exploit. And I mean, so they knew this idea that, oh, the Archduke got shot and nobody knew what to do about it. I mean, you know, they had the Kaiser was wargaming for this. Okay, so, you know, when he says, all right, this is good. The Archduke's been shot. We got the pieces together. We got the Army ready. We got the Navy ready. Let's start playing these little manipulative games with our kind of stupider Austrian and Russian cousins, because, you know, he really looked down on all those guys. So this is what they started doing. And, you know, you have that going on. And then you have this idea where you talk about Ernst Younger being in more combat than these British guys. This was a perfect example of what I was writing. Because, you know, a lay historian, what will they do? They're going to take a Siegfried Sassoon poem for the British, and then they're going to take All Quiet on the Western Front for the Germans, and they're going to say it's the exact same experience, exact same experience, exact same experience. And if you go up against that thesis, then you look like the bad guy who's a warmonger. But I say, okay, let's dig into this a little deeper. The thing that I was really amazed by that was not ever covered in any of the lay literature or any of the movies, for example, was how the British Army operationally and tactically was structured differently than the German Army, and it was structured much differently than the French Army. And the British system, you know, in the German system, which is what most people are familiar with, you've got the stormtrooper units, and they're taking all of the best guys out of all of the line infantry units, and they're putting them in the stormtrooper units, and they're using those stormtrooper units as essentially these special forces, strike forces. Now, in our contemporary American Department of Defense, we have modeled ourselves off of this German model, where we're going to take all of our best guys and we're going to put them either in Green Berets or the Navy SEALs or the 75th Ranger Regiment. You know, we're going to put them in this Special Operations Forces Command, and we're going to use them as this strike force. And over the last 20 years, we have done that, where we send these guys over for 8, 9, 10 deployments repeatedly. Meanwhile, we keep our regular line units, and we're not giving them any of the kind of training that they need to conduct these operations. Whereas the British model, because the British Army was essentially, you could liken it to the contemporary Marine Corps. In the United States Marine Corps today, they don't get any funding because it all goes to the Army. And the British Army didn't get any funding because it all went to the Navy because they were an island nation. So this created a culture where they were starved for funds. They really had to make the most of the resources they were given. And it also attracted a lot of extremely eccentric people that were really outside of the box thinkers. So when the British Army was expanded, they said under Lord Kitchener became the head of the War Department. He was quite an interesting character. He was a guy that his biography is interesting in and of itself. Maybe I'll talk about that later. I'll try not to go too deep into the weeds. But so when they organized this force, the guy who was in charge of the training was a guy named Ivor Maxis. And he said, okay, we're going to give everybody the same high-level standard of training. We're not going to have like, this regiment over here is going to be better trained than this regiment over here. They said, this isn't going to work. We're going to give them the same level of training across the board. And then what they would do is, because they all had the same level of training, they would only keep these guys in combat for a week. And then on a monthly cycle, 3 weeks out of the month, they would be in the back recuperating, because they said there is actually no way we're going to be able to maintain keeping these guys in here because it's so bad. So they'd send them in there for a week, and then they'd send them to the rear echelon for 3 weeks to recuperate. Whereas in the German experience, which was what, Ernst Younger was dealing with, hey, we got a stormtrooper unit. Okay, we're going to send them out there until everybody is dead. And this became a real problem for them.
That's the the reason that's not how they went in organized.
No, that's not
That
how
was
they
an
went in at all.
adaptation.
That's what it became in
Yeah, so
1916, 17, 18.
yeah, so that was an adaptation to the fact that they didn't have the manpower. They were getting bled white, and you'll see the same thing in World War II. You get Audie Murphy, okay, the most famous American combatant in World War II, and you compare his combat time. They pulled him out because they needed a hero. They didn't need people to know what this kind of warfare really did to people. So being an exceptional guy like Audie Murphy, that gets you pulled out and used for propaganda. There are any number of guys. If you read Iron Cross Sniper on the Eastern Front, or if you read
Yeah,
Forgotten Soldier by Guy
yeah,
Sager,
Guy Sager.
these guys just they were in for the long haul, because which is that's what you get. This is why the German general staff from around the Civil War were working on this plan on how you win a quick war, because they always knew that they couldn't win a long war. They even worked on a quick war plan for World War One when the technology wasn't available, because Germany's a plane. It's actually an invasion route. This comes clear during the Cold War, when everybody in American military commands knows that they cannot defend Germany, West Germany, against the Warsaw Pact, because it's a natural invasion route. Once you take, the only thing that slowed down the Romans was the forest. Well, once the forest's gone, it's it's just this flat place. Um, and I played a lot of Napoleonic war games. You know, Prussia is just always in a hopeless spot, because of where they are. You have the mercantile nations on the coast. They have a supercharged economy because they have access on the Atlantic. They have access to North America, South America, and Africa. And Germany doesn't. And on the other side of Germany is Russia, which is 10, 20 times, 30 times bigger than Germany. So it's Germany as a nation is actually the pivot. So it's like the pivot point trying to fight against the rest of the body. It's just it's like your guts trying to uh, control your feet and your arms and everything like that. So that basically kept looping back around to quick war solutions, technology as a solution, and then the Americans would adopt German means. One, because it worked better than what the British did. Okay, British were not capable of winning World War One. The Americans won World War One when everybody else was already worn out. And it was the same thing with World War II. Brits weren't capable of winning it. But the Americans with took the German solution to, okay, we're way outnumbered, and we have to keep our best guys out there. Okay, how do we make the most of it? America, when it basically wins at the end in 1945, the American population doesn't have the stomach for massive military losses. So you could take the German solution of kind of leaning on special operations, which is all going to be voluntary. Okay. So you don't have to draft people for that. And the German solution ends up becoming the American solution after America goes through Vietnam, because it's for two different reasons, but it kind of does reconnect to the warrior thing, because now you're dealing with volunteers, where it's no longer just the soldiers. So there is Dupree. I read his book 6 or 7 times. It's the only good book my brother-in-law had 6, 7 years in a row. Went to visit them for Christmas. It's called A Genius for War. He tries to. He was a U.S. combatant in World War II. He tried to explain why the German military inflicted 3-1 losses, whether it was attacking or defending, across 3 different wars: Franco-Prussian War, World War One, World War II. And he said at first he thought, well, they were just killing more of us because they were defending and they had the defender's advantage. But then when he went and did the research, he's like, wow, they always inflict 3-1 losses. You know, so what lessons can the U.S. know? I think he ended up teaching at the U.S. Army War College. So Dupre is one of the threads that you can follow as far as like how German military thought kind of gets co-opted by the American military thinkers, and applied pretty much after Vietnam.
Yeah, well, and even even before Vietnam, they were doing this. If you've read, I know you've read Lieutenant Colonel David Hackworth's book.
Mhm.
What was I can't think of the name. It
About
was
face.
About Face, The Odyssey of an American Warrior. Yes, he talks about that where he says, in the 50s, the German fetish for all things German was starting to take over the army,
Yeah.
and he didn't like this. And I don't think it's a positive thing either at all. And that was really a big part of what my first book was about, because you also had this model where in Vietnam, you're keeping these guys there for 13 months. There is no rotation out of there for a unit being deployed. And this was, a lot of these Vietnam guys talk about, okay, this was so bad because, in World War II, in the Pacific particularly, okay, they go in, they'd attack, say Tarawa or Okinawa or wherever, and then those guys would be out for quite a few weeks. So they were not in there for 13 months in Okinawa or 13 months in Iwo Jima Strait. And they're like, this is just not psychologically healthy to do this. Well, okay, by Vietnam, they start doing this. And, this had all kind of problems because it says, so we've kept these guys in there for 13 months. They have a lot of knowledge and experience, but they're just completely completely wiped out and exhausted. And then we send another unit in. This unit has no experience. We're going to keep them there for 13 months. They gain experience, but they're wiped out and emotionally exhausted. It leads them to say, there was one, general, when they were doing the autopsy on Vietnam, they said, we weren't in Vietnam for like 10 years. We were in Vietnam once 10 times, over and over and over again. And they never fixed that in Iraq and Afghanistan. They did the exact same thing for 20 years. And there were, so many officers. John Nagel was one, who was H.R. McMaster was one. A lot of these guys wrote about this saying, hey, let's learn from Vietnam. Let's learn from Vietnam. Let's learn from Vietnam. And it never happened. It never happened. And why I wrote this book in 2014 was my own contribution to that discussion. Obviously did not change anything, but it was bought at a homeschool convention by a few people, but it was really, it's a, there is, you referenced Dupree's book, and he is kind of the go-to guy in the official view of the Germans. There is this mystique about them because they were killing so many of the enemy that I think the Department of Defense was just enamored with. But as a system,
they want effects,
we're taking a system that was used by guys that lost both of their wars. Okay, so they had great operational success. It was not sustainable. It lost. And if you look at the 3 wars we fought, Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, guess what? We've lost those too. As a German model, it's not sustainable. My friend of mine, who I've talked about, he was a military faculty at Marine Corps University. He was a Mustang. He was enlisted and then became an officer. And before he retired, Marine Corps University was his final gig. And the thing they were doing there was systems theory, operational systems theory. How do all these things in a system intertwine and how do they work? And if you have a couple good elements of a system, but the whole system fails, why would you use that? That just sounds crazy.
Look, they're chasing technological success. So this is what gets you into the war to begin with. The Germans figured out how to jerry-rig their army to do better in World War II than in World War I by going back and studying Confederate cavalry tactics that some of their observers had witnessed in the American Civil War. So they corrected that, and they tried to match that with a new technology, and they started they started focusing everything on technology. If you're trying to use new, better technology, you want to put your best guys in that driver's seat. You don't want it to be this mass thing where you're trying to give all 20 million men in your army the best technology. No, most of them are just going to be support, and then the sharpest guys are going to get this new technology. America, and the Soviet Union continued that, to a large degree. World War II, from the American and Soviet perspective, was just who was going to get the most Nazi scientists. It's the only reason why we went to the moon. I would like to think it was an African American janitor that did those calculations, but look, our space program went away when our Nazi scientists got too old to run it. Okay, so the Operation Paperclip. But that is, there's a really good science fiction author that most people don't know about. His name was Philip Jose Farmer.
Oh yeah.
And he wrote the Riverworld series, was his best thing. We could talk about that when we do like British Empire fiction, okay? Because Richard Francis Burton is his character in that. He wrote a novel called Two Hawks from Earth. And it is a novel about a man that's piloting a bomber going whole the field from North Africa, the Romanian oil fields. And he's about to be shot down by a Messerschmitt pilot. The Messerschmitt pilot chases him through some kind of wormhole to an alternate history. So it's up with, I don't know, it was a B-17 or something, crash landing to get away from this Messerschmitt pilot that's trying to shoot him down. He ends up in a World War I situation. He ends up in an alternate Earth that didn't progress as quickly technologically as his Earth did. And there's not even the same national setups because the nations end up looking different. But basically, you still have cavalry, you got rifle-bearing infantry, and I think they have some primitive armored cars or something like that. They don't have tanks. They don't have any planes. So he ends up becoming the military advisor to develop an air force for one side, and the Messerschmitt pilot, his competitor, helping the other side develop their air force. Okay, but it was a really cool novel, and his editor actually forced him to write a happy ending. So when it came back into his possession, he reissued it with what he thought was a realistic ending, because the editor wanted a John Carter of Mars type thing where the hero marries the princess and goes to the top of the hierarchy. And this guy did have a relationship with a female aristocrat in this story. So the editor said they got to have a happily ever after thing. So after the novel came back into his property, he rewrote the last chapter about how this bitch dumped him because he was a working class American guy who was a half-breed Indian, and she was this rich Swedish girl. And you know what? After the war is won and the peril's over, well, now she's going to want a safer choice in a mate, somebody that she can dominate. So Philip Jose Farmer is an interesting character because his editors forced him to write sex scenes he didn't want to write, to write happy endings he didn't want to write. So anyhow, that was what he did there. He was a real good writer as far as what technology does to interact with humanity, and it really have now where a couple of thousand guys do all the fighting. Okay. And now one of the things it's doing is there is a logic to it. I read an interview, Esquire magazine was one of the two guys that shot bin Laden's wife and claimed to have shot him. Okay. And he couldn't stay in the Navy SEALs anymore because they had to do so many combat deployments. They'd go crazy. Okay. Well, what is the purpose for these special operations units other than the fact that you want your best guys with your high potency technology, so you go in with a small footprint and you can get a lot of stuff done and you don't have to feed 100,000 guys sitting on this beach? Well, that's one of the reasons. It's that same technological efficiency reason that they've all got their eye on, and it starts with a gun. So the other thing is America has low tolerance for casualties, because essentially our country doesn't go to war for really reasons that most of its members think are good reasons. Okay. At any given time, most of the people in this country don't think we should be doing whatever our military is doing. So we can't be getting just all of our regular, C-grade athletes and B-grade students just getting slaughtered fighting in these wars to prop up these dictators on the other side. So you need special ops for that to make it military sustainable. Go one step beyond that. What are all these special ops guys forced to do? And I know some of these guys. To get their pension, they've got to stay in for 20 years of combat. That's a total psychological experiment, okay? Nobody's done that. The only guy that tried to do that was Alexander the Great with his army, and they mutinied in India because they couldn't take it anymore, okay? It takes a very special person to live 20 years in constant war, all right? So this, you're not going to make an American into a Mongol horseman, okay? So what this does is this gives you a choice. I can go insane in 7 or 8 years and end up being drugged up by the VA for the rest of my life and being this psychiatric experiment, or I could put in my 6 years and I can go into contracting and I can make more money in a month than I would make in the next 2 years or the next 4 years. And killed, this is where it serves the government. If he gets killed, that casualty is off the books.
Right.
This was clear in the movie on the debacle in Benghazi. Okay.
Oh yeah.
Not a subject I was interested in. I did enjoy watching the movie, but the whole where the special operations thing goes socially is to military contracting, because that's the guys that are going to come back into your country and kill your people for you. It's going to be a really hard sell to get Navy SEALs and special operations U.S. servicemen to go back and basically burn down their own town when the government starts collecting the guns. Okay, that's going to be a hard sell. You might have some mutinies. Okay, but military contractors will do that, have already done that in this country. I was talked to by 4 military contractors in 2015 in Baltimore City, and these goons in their BDUs with no insignia told me to get off the street of my city on my block. These guys weren't even from Baltimore. I have already personally experienced with another person what the future of living in the Western world is going to be. And it's going to be harried by savages on one side, okay? They come from lands where people die of the machete virus, okay? And on the other side, these guys are going to swoop in this wonderful machine, this $250,000 car that these 4 guys are in that look like they could be the front 4 for an NFL team. And these BDUs grinning, just hoping that me and Mescaline Franklin are going to talk back to them so they can beat our asses, okay? And they're going to boss us off of our street. They're going to tell us at 10 o'clock at night, okay, sir, yeah, you're not, you're an American, you're a Baltimorean. You're not allowed to walk on the sidewalk, even though you're not bothering anybody, okay? So that's the seduction. It's not because you're not going to have another big industrial war. All these conservatives are having these fantasies about Iran and China and Russia are all going to fight the U.S. in a giant land war and everything. Big countries aren't stupid enough to do that stuff anymore. It's going to be little wars fought with special operations guys using your nifty new equipment. And then the pressure is going to kick them out of that because they're going to go insane. They're going to go into military contracting. Then you can use them in your own country and you can use them in other countries. I think half the guys we lost in Afghanistan weren't even enlisted in the U.S. military. Okay. They were contractors, So that's why nobody gave a shit about Afghanistan, because your son wasn't getting drafted and go forced to fight these goat herders, so that the opium crop could be brought home, to drug him up after he gets his foot blown off,
Well, and think about this, that, that's not even a new development. You're right, because go even back further to post 1945, and the United States tells Britain and France, we're going to cut off all of your Lend-Lease aid that your economy is running on if you do not decolonize your empires. And, you know, the British and the French and the Dutch and everybody say, okay, are you nuts? You're going to have complete and total chaos doing this. Okay. You want to talk about machete virus? You're going to have an outbreak of machete virus. Okay.
Well, that's still ongoing. You have,
of course it is. Machete virus has been going on for 75 years since 1945.
You have you had a bunch of dirty little wars there, but you currently have Chinese and American military. I know numerous American military men who have served in undeclared war zones in Africa. Okay. Yeah. You have a whole command down there. And this is going to be I know a guy that works for a private contracting company who spends a lot of time in the Central African Republic and in the Congo. And this is in support of private international companies that are more often than not based in the United States. So what the United States did with that bit of bullying, the geopolitical bullying that you just described, was free these markets up for exploitation by international American-based companies. And they will ultimately, the best way to support those companies is to have private troops do it, just like, you know, the Dutch West Indies Company and the various British companies did it before you had the disastrous mutiny of 1857. And then you and it becomes a government thing, you know. So I see you're born in the world, and you're living a nice simple. You're going to have is eventually you're going to have it to the Brits in 1857 when this mismanagement of their private company that was running a military in India resulted in a mutiny. Okay. And one of the Queen's secret agents that predicted this and was ignored was Richard Francis Burton. And he said, I told you so. And then he got shipped to someplace else as punishment. It remains to be seen. It's not going to happen in my lifetime, but it will probably happen in your lifetime. There will be something like that. There will be an overseas disaster that's going to be presided over by a bunch of U.S. military contractors employing former U.S. active military people as private citizens for corporations. There's going to be some kind of disaster in the future. It'll make for great adventure novels like that movie about Benghazi. That was a good movie. That was exciting. And something like the British Empire or like the current American Empire, where it's going, it gets you a lot of really exciting little last stands where you got 10 guys running out of ammo fighting off a whole horde of people, because it's going to be run as a private operation on a shoestring.
100%. Well, and that was the British model. And you definitely preempted what I was saying, that they called in all these contractors to handle this stuff. And 2 Pulp Fiction movies, one of my favorites, Dark of the Sun with Rod Taylor, but a second one that's better known is Flight of the Wild Geese with Roger Moore and Richard Harris and
good movie.
Richard Burton, great movie. And another one, Dogs of War with Christopher Walken, is another one
that
from
was
1980.
really realistic. Yeah, that was a nice realistic movie. Yeah.
I enjoyed that one. But to bring home what you're saying, you're 100% right. And the thing is, I don't think, for the record, okay, I do not think contracting is a negative thing. It could be used for something. A lot of things in life are like fire. You can use it to keep the house warm in a fireplace. You can also use it to burn down the house. You know, how are you going to use it? But you know, you're 100% right on these things. And, you know, the contractors are a great disposable tool for a variety of reasons. Read Eric Prince from Blackwater, which, and I have no problem with Eric Prince of Blackwater. I know most people don't like him. I have no issue with it. He read his book about his company and read any of his interviews. He says a contractor's great because he said you use these guys, they're not there, you declare that they're not there, and then if something goes wrong in the disaster, you can throw them under the bus. Which is like what happened in 2007. And you could say, well, you know, those are just dirty, rotten mercenaries that are there for money. When they're the same guy that 2 years ago was wearing a Navy SEAL uniform, and he was the nation's pride. He was a hero, you know, and now you can say, well, he's a greedy SOB. And that's a, you know, that's a real, and he doesn't like that. He talks about that regularly. He says, why do you do that? He says, you call on these people and you use them, and you abuse him, and then, you know, he really got burned by his DOD contracts, and he talks a lot about that because he was a Navy SEAL, and you know, and he said, you know, he had a plan for Afghanistan. He said, you turn it like, he said, the strategy needs to be you make it like the East India Company, where he said you have an American viceroy who runs Afghanistan, and then you've got 6,000 retired special forces guys, and they are NCOs and officers in the Afghan army, so they can give direct orders to Afghan troops. They can control the training, they can control the logistics, they can control the pay. Because, you know, a lot of these guys, I mean, one friend I had, he was over there, and he was over there early in Afghanistan in the early years when the Americans were still doing a lot of the logistical things, and they were paying the Afghan troops. And they said the big hope was that by the next year, Afghans were going to get to pay Afghans because, you know, God bless the nation state in the Treaty of Westphalia. God forbid we have a guy with blue eyes and a sunburn giving money to a guy with brown eyes and not a sunburn, shall we say, okay? Because when you know, an Afghan can hand an Afghan money, that's a magical thing, okay? So, you know, he got out and wasn't over there. Well, he ran into his buddy, and his buddy was over there the next year, and he said, hey, did we ever get Afghans paying Afghans? How did that go? And he said, oh, how did it go? Oh, we got Afghans to pay Afghans. No Afghan got paid because the guy we put in charge of paying the Afghan, guess what? He pocketed all that money. And that's the thing. We're going to give all these guys these billions of dollars. And so, you know, this idiot who's running a institution that conducts our diplomacy, okay, at the time of this recording, what is this? It is September 19th, 2021. He comes out and says, well, you know, if we paid and trained the Afghans for 20 years and it didn't do anything for them, a couple weeks isn't going to do anything for them. It goes, what are you talking about? You know, none of these guys got paid. None of these guys got trained. It was a Ponzi scheme that a lot of these Afghans in the military command ran to enrich themselves, you know. I mean, I had a friend, he was the